Steve Harvey had seen uncomfortable moments on Family Feud before. He had seen husbands give answers that made their wives glare at them. He had seen wives reveal embarrassing secrets. He had seen couples argue, families shout, contestants freeze, and people say things on national television that they immediately wished they could take back. Usually, Steve could turn the moment into a joke. That was part of his gift. He could look at the audience, raise one eyebrow, wait 3 seconds, and somehow make an entire studio laugh. But on this particular afternoon, nobody was laughing. Not Steve, not the audience, and especially not the woman standing beside her husband with tears filling her eyes. Her name was Rachel Bennett. She was 34 years old, a school counselor from Charlotte, North Carolina, and she had been married to her husband, Daniel, for almost 11 years. When the Bennett family first walked onto the Family Feud stage, they looked like the kind of family producers loved. They were energetic. They were funny. They hugged each other before the cameras started. Daniel was confident and loud. Rachel was quieter, but she smiled whenever someone spoke to her. Daniel's younger brother Marcus kept making jokes. Rachel's sister Emily looked nervous but excited. From the audience, everything seemed normal. But Steve noticed something during the introductions. Every time Rachel answered a question about herself, Daniel interrupted. When Steve asked Rachel what she did for work, she said, "I'm a counselor at a middle school." Daniel immediately laughed. "She counsels everybody except her own husband." The audience laughed. Rachel smiled too. But it was a small smile. Steve looked at her for half a second longer than usual. Then he moved on. "What about you, Daniel?" "I work in commercial sales," Daniel said proudly. "I've been doing it 13 years. 13 years? Yes, sir, you good at it?" Daniel grinned. "I'm very good at talking people into things." Steve looked at Rachel. Rachel looked down. Steve smiled at the audience. "Well, brother, I don't know why, but I feel like that answer is going to matter later." The audience laughed again. The game started. For the first 20 minutes, the Bennetts were doing well. Daniel was competitive. Whenever a family member got an answer right, he celebrated loudly. Whenever someone gave a bad answer, he shook his head dramatically. Rachel gave 2 strong answers in the first round and helped the family take an early lead. The other family, the Washingtons from Ohio, fought back in the second round. Soon the game became close. Everything still felt normal. Then came the question that changed the entire afternoon. Steve walked to the center podium. Rachel and Daniel were facing each other. Steve looked at the card. "We asked 100 married people." The audience became quiet. "Name something your spouse might do that tells you your marriage is in trouble." Daniel hit the buzzer first. "Stop talking to you." Steve nodded. "Stop talking." The board revealed the number 2 answer. The Bennetts decided to play. Daniel returned to his family. Steve walked to Rachel's sister Emily first. Emily answered, "Sleep in another room." It was on the board. Marcus said, "Take off the wedding ring." That was there too. Then Steve reached Rachel. "Rachel," she looked at him. "Name something your spouse might do that tells you your marriage is in trouble." Rachel hesitated. The audience waited. Daniel whispered from beside her, "Come on, babe." Rachel looked toward him. Then back at Steve. "Pack a suitcase." Daniel's smile disappeared. Steve noticed immediately. He repeated the answer, "Pack a suitcase." The board revealed it as the number 1 answer. The audience cheered. But Rachel did not celebrate. Neither did Daniel. Steve slowly turned toward her. "You said that pretty fast." A few people laughed. Rachel gave a nervous smile. "It's a good answer." It was the number 1 answer. Steve started walking away. Then Daniel laughed. But it was not a relaxed laugh. It sounded forced. He looked at Steve and said, "She would know." The audience reacted with a mixture of laughter and surprise. Steve stopped. Rachel's face changed. Steve turned around. "What does that mean?" Daniel was still smiling. "Nothing. She's always threatening to pack a bag when she gets mad." Rachel stared at him. Daniel continued, "Every argument, man, she starts talking about leaving." Rachel's sister Emily stopped smiling. Steve looked from Daniel to Rachel. "Is that true?" Rachel took a breath. "Not exactly." Daniel laughed again. "Oh, come on." Steve raised his hand. "Let her answer." The audience became quiet. Rachel looked uncomfortable. "We've been having some problems." Daniel shook his head. "Every marriage has problems. Rachel said nothing. Steve could sense that the mood had changed completely. So he tried to move the game forward. All right. We got the number one answer. Let's keep playing. They completed the round. The Bennetts eventually won the game by a narrow margin. Normally, that would have meant screaming, hugging, and celebrating. Instead, Rachel stood almost completely still. Her family hugged her. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. Rachel quietly moved away from him. Steve noticed. Daniel noticed too. But the cameras were still running. The show moved toward fast money. The family chose Daniel and Marcus to play. Rachel stepped to the side of the stage with Emily. For the first time that afternoon, she looked relieved to be away from her husband. Emily leaned close to her. "You okay?" Rachel nodded, but tears were already appearing in her eyes. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I just need to get through this." Emily took her hand. "You don't have to go back with him tonight." Rachel closed her eyes. "I know." Neither woman realized that Steve had walked close enough to hear the final sentence. He stopped. For a moment he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "Go back where?" Rachel looked up. Her face turned pale. Emily stepped away. "Mr. Harvey, it's okay." Steve looked at Rachel. "Is it?" Daniel was across the stage preparing for fast money. The audience couldn't hear the conversation yet. Rachel wiped her face. "I didn't want this happening here." "What happening?" Rachel hesitated. Then she said something Steve did not expect. "I'm not going home with my husband tonight." Steve's expression changed. He looked toward Daniel, then back at Rachel. "Does he know?" "No." "Does your family know?" "My sister does." Steve lowered his voice. "Are you safe?" Rachel nodded immediately. "Yes, he's never hit me." "Nothing like that." Steve nodded. That mattered. Rachel continued. "It's not that. I can't keep living the way we've been living." Steve looked at Emily. Emily nodded slowly. This has been coming for a long time. Before Steve could ask another question, a producer approached. They needed him. Fast money was ready. Steve looked at Rachel one more time. "You sure you want to keep going?" Rachel nodded. "Please, let my family finish." Steve returned to the stage. The cameras started again. Daniel and Marcus played fast money. They did well. Very well. Their combined score passed 200 points. The Bennetts had won $20,000. The audience exploded. Daniel jumped into the air. Marcus hugged him. Rachel's family rushed onto the stage. Daniel immediately went toward Rachel. "We did it." Rachel smiled, but it looked painful. Daniel wrapped his arms around her. She stayed stiff. Then, he whispered something into her ear. Nobody in the audience heard it. But Rachel did. "See? Now you can stop acting crazy and come home." Rachel pulled away. "What?" Daniel smiled because the cameras were still on them. "Let's go home and celebrate." Rachel stared at him. Then something changed in her face. Maybe she had spent months trying to find the right moment. Maybe she had spent years making excuses. Maybe she had planned to wait until after the show. But at that moment, under the bright studio lights, she simply stopped pretending. "No." Daniel's smile remained. "What?" "I'm not going home with you." The nearest family members heard her. Then Steve heard her. The audience gradually became quiet. Daniel looked around. He seemed embarrassed. "Rachel, stop." She shook her head. "I'm serious." Daniel lowered his voice. "We're not doing this here." Rachel answered just as quietly. "You brought it up here." Daniel looked toward Steve. "Man, can we cut this?" Steve said nothing. Daniel took Rachel gently by the elbow. "Come on." Rachel immediately pulled her arm away. No, the room went silent. It was no longer funny. It was no longer a game show moment. Steve stepped closer. Daniel looked at him. "Yeah?" She said no. Daniel let go. "I wasn't doing anything." "I didn't say you were." Daniel looked frustrated. "Mr. Harvey, with all respect, this is between me and my wife." Steve nodded. "You're right." Daniel seemed relieved. Then Steve added, "And that's exactly why we probably shouldn't turn it into entertainment." Steve removed the cards from his hand. He placed them on the podium. Then he looked toward the producers. "I'm done." The audience gasped. Daniel stared at him. Rachel looked confused. Steve turned away from the cameras and walked off the stage. For several seconds, nobody moved. The audience did not know whether this was part of the show. It wasn't. A producer called for the cameras to stop. The studio lights remained bright, but suddenly the entire room felt different. Daniel looked angry. What just happened? Marcus approached him. Calm down. I am calm. No, you're not. Rachel stood with Emily, her hands were shaking. Behind the curtain, Steve spoke to the executive producer. I'm not standing up there while somebody feels pressured to leave with somebody they just said they don't want to leave with. The producer nodded. We can stop taping. I don't care about the episode. Steve looked back toward the stage. Make sure she has transportation. Make sure she has somewhere to go. Then we figure out what happens. A staff member approached Rachel and Emily. They were taken to a private dressing room. Daniel was taken to another room with his brother. For almost 20 minutes, there were no cameras, no audience reactions, no jokes. Just two people sitting in separate rooms, facing a truth that had been waiting for them long before they ever came to Family Feud. Rachel sat on a couch beside her sister. For the first 5 minutes, she said nothing. Then she began crying. Emily put an arm around her. I ruined everything. No, we were supposed to have fun. Mom was so excited. Everybody came all this way. You didn't ruin anything. Rachel looked at her. I embarrassed him. Emily sighed. Rachel, you've spent 10 years worrying about embarrassing Daniel. When are you going to worry about what this marriage is doing to you? Rachel looked down. That question hurt, because she already knew the answer. For the first 4 years of their marriage, Rachel and Daniel had been happy. Not perfect, but happy. They met when Rachel was 22, and Daniel was 25. He was confident, funny, ambitious, and impossible to ignore. Rachel had always been cautious. Daniel made life feel bigger. He planned surprise weekends. He sent flowers to her job. He talked constantly about the future. A house, children, travel, a life they would build together. 2 years after meeting, they were married. Their first apartment was small. They had one old couch, a television that only worked when somebody hit the side, and barely enough money left after rent. Rachel would later say those were some of the happiest years of her life. They didn't have much, but they talked. Every night, they talked about work, money, their fears, their dreams, everything. Then Daniel's career took off. He became one of the best salesmen in his company. His income doubled, then doubled again. They bought a house. Rachel finished graduate school and became a counselor. From the outside, they looked successful. But the more successful Daniel became at work, the more he started bringing his work personality home. Everything became a negotiation. Every disagreement became something he had to win. If Rachel disagreed with him about money, he explained why she was wrong. If she asked him to spend more time at home, he told her she didn't understand the pressure of his career. If she cried during an argument, he accused her of becoming emotional because she had no logical answer. Slowly, Rachel stopped arguing. Then Daniel complained that she never communicated. 3 years earlier, Rachel asked him to attend marriage counseling. Daniel laughed. I'm not paying someone to tell me how to talk to my own wife. 6 months later, she asked again. He refused again. The next year, she suggested it on their anniversary after they spent most of dinner sitting in silence. Daniel became angry. Why are you obsessed with convincing yourself our marriage is broken? Rachel had looked at him across the restaurant table. Because I feel alone when you're sitting right beside me. Daniel had no answer. But he still refused counseling. The real breaking point came 7 months before Family Feud. Rachel's mother needed surgery. Rachel began spending more time helping her parents. Instead of supporting her, Daniel complained that she was never home. One evening, after Rachel returned exhausted from the hospital, she found Daniel watching television. He asked what they were having for dinner. Rachel stared at him. My mother had surgery today. I know. And you're asking me what I'm cooking? I was just asking. There's food in the refrigerator. Daniel became defensive. Why do you always turn everything into a fight? Rachel laughed in disbelief. Then she walked upstairs. That night she packed a suitcase. She didn't leave. She sat on the edge of the bed looking at the bag for almost an hour. Finally Daniel came upstairs. He saw it. What is this? Rachel said, I don't know if I can keep doing this. For one moment, Daniel looked scared. Rachel thought he finally understood. Then his expression hardened. You're being dramatic. Those 3 words changed something inside her. She unpacked the suitcase. But not because she had decided to stay. She unpacked it because she realized that when she eventually left, she did not want to do it during an argument. She wanted to do it calmly, properly, without screaming, without threats. She began saving money in a separate account. She spoke to her sister. She found a small apartment close to her job. She contacted a counselor. And 3 days before the Family Feud taping, she signed a 6-month lease. She hadn't told Daniel yet. The family had been planning the Family Feud trip for months. Rachel almost canceled, but her parents and siblings were excited, so she told herself she would get through one last family event. Then she would go home and tell Daniel everything. She never expected the survey question about a suitcase. She never expected Daniel to joke about it, and she definitely never expected Steve Harvey to overhear her telling Emily she wasn't going home with him. Back in Daniel's dressing room, a very different conversation was happening. Daniel was pacing. I can't believe she's doing this. Marcus sat quietly. Doing what? Humiliating me on television. Marcus looked at his older brother. Is that really what you're worried about right now? Daniel stopped. What am I supposed to be worried about? Your wife just said she doesn't want to go home with you. Daniel shook his head. She gets emotional. She'll calm down. Marcus stared at him. You really don't hear yourself, do you? Daniel's expression tightened. Whose side are you on? This isn't about sides. She's been complaining about our marriage for years. Marcus leaned forward. Exactly. Daniel stopped speaking. Marcus continued. You just said she's been complaining for years, like that proves she's wrong. Maybe it proves she's been trying to tell you something for years. Daniel sat down. For the first time all afternoon, he looked less angry than afraid. She signed up for this trip with me. So? She was laughing yesterday. Marcus shook his head. People can laugh and still be unhappy. Daniel looked at the floor. She wouldn't actually leave. Marcus asked quietly, how do you know? Daniel did not answer. A few minutes later, Steve entered Rachel's dressing room. He didn't bring cameras. He didn't bring producers. He sat in a chair across from Rachel. You okay? Rachel nodded. I'm embarrassed. About what? All of this. Steve leaned back. Can I tell you something? Rachel nodded. I've been doing television a long time. People think because you're on a stage, every moment belongs to the audience. He shook his head. It doesn't. Rachel wiped her eyes. I didn't mean to make a scene. You didn't. Daniel's going to say I did. Steve paused. Do you want to leave separately? Yes. Do you have somewhere safe to go? My sister is staying at a hotel. I'm going with her tonight. Then I'm going back to Charlotte. I already have an apartment. Steve looked surprised. So this wasn't a decision you made 5 minutes ago? No. How long? Rachel hesitated. Probably 2 years. Steve nodded slowly. Then don't let anybody convince you this happened because of one question on a game show. Rachel began crying again. I still love him. Steve nodded. That can be true too. She looked at him. I don't hate Daniel. He's not some terrible person. That's what makes this so hard. Steve listened. He works hard. He helps his family. He can be generous. People love him. She swallowed. But somewhere along the way he stopped listening to me. Everything I felt became something he had to correct. Steve remained silent. I kept thinking if I explained it better, he'd understand. Then I started wondering if maybe I really was the problem. Steve leaned forward. Don't make a decision today because of me, this audience, or this show. Rachel nodded. But if you've already made a decision after years of thinking about it, don't abandon it just because people are watching. Rachel looked relieved. Thank you. Steve stood. At the door he stopped. One more thing. Rachel looked up. You don't owe anybody a dramatic ending. That sentence stayed with her. Steve then went to see Daniel. The conversation was shorter. Daniel immediately said, I want to talk to my wife. Steve nodded. I'm not stopping you from talking. Then where is she? She's in another room. Daniel looked frustrated. Why is everybody treating me like I'm dangerous? Nobody said you're dangerous. Then why can't I go get my wife? Steve looked directly at him. Because she asked for space. Daniel laughed bitterly. She's my wife. Steve's expression became serious. That doesn't mean she belongs to you. Daniel stopped. The room became quiet. Steve continued, marriage gives you responsibilities to each other. It doesn't erase somebody's right to say, I need space. Daniel looked away. I love her. I believe you. Then help me fix this. Steve shook his head. I can't fix your marriage. Daniel looked surprised. I can tell jokes. I can host this show. I can give you my opinion. But your marriage? That's work you've got to do when there ain't no cameras. Daniel sat down. Steve looked toward Marcus. Your brother said something you probably need to hear. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Steve continued. Your wife has apparently been asking you to hear her for years. Daniel rubbed his face. She wanted counseling. Did you go? No. Why? I thought we could handle our own problems. Steve nodded. And how'd that work out? Daniel had no answer. About 40 minutes after Steve first walked off the stage, he returned. The audience was still there. The producers had explained only that filming had been paused for a personal matter. Steve walked to the center of the stage alone. The audience applauded. He raised his hand. Thank you. The room became quiet. Sometimes we come in here thinking we're making a game show. He looked around the studio. But families don't stop being real families just because cameras come on. He paused. So we're not going to turn somebody's private pain into a circus. The audience applauded. Steve continued. The Bennett family won the game. They won their money. That part is done. Another round of applause. But we're ending today's taping here. Daniel and Rachel never returned to the stage together that day. Rachel left the studio with Emily. Daniel left almost an hour later with Marcus. They spent the night in different hotels. For the first time in 11 years, neither knew exactly what the next morning would look like. Daniel called Rachel 17 times that night. She didn't answer. Then he sent a message. Please just tell me you're safe. Rachel responded. I'm safe. I need space. We can talk tomorrow. Daniel stared at those words for a long time. His first instinct was to call again. His second was to send a long message defending himself. For once, he did neither. The next afternoon, they met in the hotel lobby with Emily nearby. Daniel looked exhausted. Rachel looked nervous. He sat across from her. So you're really leaving? Rachel nodded. For now. Because of yesterday? No. Daniel looked confused. Rachel placed a key on the table. It wasn't their house key. It was the key to her new apartment. I signed the lease 3 days ago. Daniel stared at it. You already planned this? Yes. His face changed. How long have you been lying to me? Rachel looked at him. I wasn't trying to trick you. You rented an apartment behind my back. Because every time I tried to talk about our marriage, you told me I was dramatic. Daniel became quiet. Rachel continued. I needed to make one decision that you couldn't argue me out of. That sentence hit him harder than anything that had happened on stage. Daniel leaned back. I would have listened. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I asked you to go to counseling 3 times. Daniel looked down. I know. I told you I felt alone. I know. I packed a suitcase 7 months ago. I remember. And what did you tell me? Daniel closed his eyes. That you were being dramatic. Rachel nodded. So no, Daniel, yesterday didn't destroy our marriage. She wiped her face. Yesterday just made it impossible for us to keep pretending everything was fine. Daniel started crying. It was the first time Rachel had seen him cry in years. What do you want me to do? Rachel answered carefully. I want you to stop asking me what you need to do to get me back. Daniel looked at her. I want you to figure out why the person you love had to leave before you were willing to listen. There was nothing Daniel could say to that. Rachel moved into her apartment the following week. At first, Daniel handled the separation badly. He sent long messages. He bought flowers. He promised vacations. He offered to sell the house. He sent photographs from their wedding. Rachel thanked him, but did not return. Finally, Marcus told him something important. You're still trying to sell her. Daniel looked offended. What? Flowers, trips, promises. You're a salesman, man. You're trying to close the deal. Marcus shook his head. Maybe for once you need to stop trying to get a result and actually change. Daniel hated hearing it. But he knew his brother was right. 2 weeks later, Daniel did something Rachel had asked him to do for years. He went to therapy. Alone, he didn't tell Rachel immediately. He didn't use it as proof. He simply went. The first sessions were uncomfortable. Daniel discovered that he had spent most of his adult life believing that being wrong made him weak. His father had been the same way. In Daniel's childhood home, apologies were rare. Arguments ended when one person became too tired to continue. Daniel had promised himself he would be different. But without realizing it, he had carried many of the same habits into his own marriage. He wasn't violent. He wasn't unfaithful. He paid the bills. He worked hard. For years, those facts had allowed him to tell himself he was a good husband. Therapy forced him to face a harder question. Was he a husband Rachel felt emotionally safe talking to? The answer was painful. No. 3 months after the Family Feud taping, Daniel sent Rachel a short message. I finally understand why you stopped talking. I made every conversation feel like a courtroom, and I always had to be the lawyer who won. I'm sorry. Rachel read the message several times. For the first time, his apology did not contain the word but. She replied, "Thank you." Nothing else happened that day, and that was important. Daniel did not demand another chance because he had finally said the right thing. Rachel did not rush back because he had started therapy. They continued living separately. Rachel started doing things she had forgotten she enjoyed. She joined a Saturday hiking group. She painted her bedroom yellow, because Daniel had always said yellow walls looked childish. She spent evenings reading without wondering whether somebody was angry that dinner wasn't ready. She started therapy too. There, she discovered that she had spent years avoiding conflict so completely that she had also stopped expressing herself. Healing required both people to see themselves clearly. 6 months after the taping, Family Feud producers contacted the Bennetts. The original episode had never aired in full. The producers had removed most of the uncomfortable confrontation, but they asked whether Rachel and Daniel would consider returning for a short follow-up. Rachel initially said no. Then Daniel surprised her. "You don't have to do it." Rachel looked at him. "You don't want to?" "I do." He paused. "But I'm trying to learn that what I want isn't automatically what we should do." Rachel smiled. It was a small smile, but this time, it was real. Eventually, they agreed. Not because they wanted to announce a perfect reconciliation. There wasn't one. They agreed because they thought the truth might help another couple. 7 months after Steve had walked off the stage, Rachel and Daniel returned. This time, they walked out separately. The audience applauded. Steve hugged Rachel. Then Daniel. He looked at both of them. Well, the audience laughed. Steve shook his head. "Last time y'all were here, I left." Daniel smiled nervously. "I noticed." Steve looked toward Rachel. "How are you?" "I'm good. You sure?" Rachel smiled. "I'm actually good." Steve turned toward Daniel. "And you?" "Better than I was." Steve nodded. "Are you two back together?" Rachel and Daniel looked at each other. Then Rachel answered, "Not exactly." The audience became quiet. Daniel explained, "We've been separated for 7 months." Steve nodded. "And?" Daniel took a breath. "And for the first time in our marriage, I think I'm actually learning how to listen." Rachel looked at him. Daniel continued, "When Rachel left, I thought my job was to convince her to come back." He looked toward the audience. "I thought if I said the perfect thing or bought the perfect gift, I could fix it." He shook his head. "Then my brother told me I was treating my marriage like a sales deal." Steve laughed. "Your brother told you the truth." "He did." Daniel smiled. "I started therapy. Not to get Rachel back. At least that's what I'm trying to make true." Rachel laughed softly. Daniel looked at her. "I had to understand that I wasn't losing my wife because she stopped loving me. I was losing her because I stopped making room for her to be heard." The audience applauded. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Steve looked at her. "What changed for you?" Rachel thought for a moment. "I learned that leaving wasn't the same as giving up." She paused. "I stayed for a long time because I thought a good wife keeps trying no matter what." She looked toward Daniel. "But sometimes continuing the same pattern isn't trying. Sometimes you have to change the pattern." Steve nodded. "So what happens now?" Rachel smiled. "We've started counseling together." Daniel added quickly, "She made me wait 5 months before she'd go with me." The audience laughed. Rachel looked at him. I needed to know you were going for yourself first. Daniel nodded. Fair. Steve raised an eyebrow. Look at you agreeing with something. The audience exploded with laughter. Daniel laughed too. That's therapy, Steve. Steve smiled. I might need that therapist's number. The atmosphere was completely different from their first appearance. There was still pain. There was still uncertainty. But there was respect. Steve looked at Rachel. So are you going home with him today? The audience reacted immediately. Rachel burst out laughing. Daniel covered his face. Steve laughed too. Then Rachel answered, We're getting dinner. Steve nodded. That's it? That's it. Same car? Rachel looked at Daniel. Daniel waited. Rachel smiled. 2 cars. The audience cheered. Daniel laughed. Progress. Steve looked into the camera. That's the answer right there. The room became quiet. Everybody wants the big ending. He looked at Rachel and Daniel. We want them to kiss. Move back in. Everything fixed. Music plays. Steve shook his head. Real life usually don't work like that. He stepped closer to them. Sometimes the victory is dinner. Rachel nodded. Sometimes the victory is somebody finally listening. Daniel nodded. And sometimes love means giving somebody enough room to decide freely whether they want to come back. The audience stood. Rachel wiped tears from her face. Daniel did too. They did not kiss. They did not make a dramatic announcement. They hugged. Then they left the stage separately. Over the next 5 months, they continued counseling. Daniel sold nothing, promised nothing, pressured nothing. Rachel made no guarantees, but slowly, something started growing between them again. Not the marriage they had before. Something different. They began going on dates. They had rules. No interrupting. No fixing the other person's feelings. No using old mistakes as weapons. If an argument became too heated, they took 20 minutes apart and returned to finish it. Daniel learned how difficult it was to listen without defending himself. Rachel learned how difficult it was to speak honestly before resentment built into silence. Almost 1 year after their first Family Feud appearance, Rachel invited Daniel to her apartment. They cooked dinner together. Afterward, Daniel noticed boxes near the door. His heart jumped. What's happening? Rachel smiled. I'm moving. Daniel froze. Where? Rachel handed him a piece of paper. It was not an address. It was a list. Counseling every other week. 1 night a week for separate activities. No making major financial decisions without discussion. No mocking serious feelings during arguments. 1 weekend every 3 months with phones off except for emergencies. At the bottom, Rachel had written one final line. We build something new. We don't pretend the old thing never broke. Daniel looked at her. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Rachel smiled. I'm saying I want to try living together again. Daniel began crying. He reached toward her, then stopped. Can I hug you? Rachel laughed through her tears. Yes, that question meant almost as much to her as the answer. A year earlier, Daniel would have simply grabbed her. Now he asked. And Rachel understood that sometimes the smallest changes revealed the biggest ones. Years later, when people asked Rachel about the day she refused to leave the Family Feud studio with her husband, she always corrected them. That wasn't the day my marriage ended, she would say. It was the day pretending ended. Daniel agreed. He would sometimes joke that Steve Harvey walking off the stage was the most important walk anybody had ever taken in his marriage. But beneath the joke was something serious. Steve hadn't saved their relationship. He hadn't repaired their marriage. He hadn't convinced Rachel to stay, or Daniel to change. He had simply refused to participate in a moment where one person felt pressured to make a personal decision because cameras were watching. And that pause changed everything. It gave Rachel permission to stand by a decision she had spent years preparing to make. It forced Daniel to face a reality he had spent years explaining away, and it showed both of them that a marriage could not survive forever on love alone. Love mattered. But love without listening became lonely. Love without respect became exhausting. Love without change became a promise people repeated while living the same painful day again and again. Rachel and Daniel eventually remained married. But when they celebrated their 15th anniversary, they did something unusual. They didn't celebrate 15 years. They celebrated 4. When friends asked why, Rachel explained. The first 11 years mattered. There was a lot of love there. She smiled at Daniel. But 4 years ago, we started building our second marriage. Daniel nodded. Same people. Rachel added, different rules. Every anniversary, they watched a small piece of their Family Feud follow-up. Not the original confrontation. They never wanted to relive that. They watched the moment Steve asked Rachel whether she was going home with Daniel. We're getting dinner, she had said. Same car? Steve asked. 2 cars. That simple answer had become a private joke between them. Because their marriage had not been saved by one dramatic apology. It had been rebuilt through hundreds of ordinary decisions. One therapy appointment. One honest conversation. One argument handled differently. One apology without an excuse. One boundary respected. One dinner. 2 cars. Then another dinner. And another. Until one day, slowly and carefully, they found themselves traveling in the same direction again. Steve would later remember the Bennett family for a different reason than most dramatic Family Feud contestants. It wasn't because somebody gave a ridiculous answer. It wasn't because a husband embarrassed himself. It wasn't because a wife created a viral television moment. It was because of what happened when the game stopped. A woman said no. A husband finally had to hear it. And an entire television production paused, rather than pretending the word meant something else. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for a relationship isn't fighting harder to keep someone. Sometimes it is respecting them enough to stop pulling. Because if love is real, it cannot be forced. It cannot be negotiated like a business deal. It cannot be protected by pretending nothing is wrong. Sometimes love needs space. Sometimes it needs accountability. Sometimes it needs counseling. And sometimes it needs one person to stand beneath bright television lights. Look at the person they still love, and finally say, I'm not leaving with you. Not because love is over, but because something has to change before love can survive.